The Honourable the Senate is now in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honor, the Acting President.
I should wish to inform honourable senators that His Honour, the Most Honourable Senator Reginald Farley, President, is absent on official business. And we have notices of lateness from Senator Dr. Maynard and Senator Dr. Rogers. Minutes.
Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that the minutes of the meeting held on Friday, 8th November 2024 and Friday, 22nd of November 2024 be now confirmed.
So moved. Okay, sorry. She has. The question is that the minutes of the meetings held on Friday, 8th November 2024 and Friday, 22nd of November be now confirmed. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no.
Madam Deputy President, if I may, first of all, have permission to remain seated.
Permission granted.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, I just have a minor amendment for the minutes of Friday, November 8th. On page 3, the second line says, Madam Deputy Speaker spoke. I assume that it should be Madam Deputy President. And so I'm asking for that change to be made so that we could accurately reflect the reality of the situation for now.
Thank you very much, Senator. I doubt that I'm likely to become Madam Deputy Speaker, but but you can't fly the face of God and you never know what is going to happen in life. So the question is that the minutes of Friday, November 22nd be confirmed and the minutes of Friday, November 8th be confirmed as amended. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam President, I beg to move that the minutes of the meeting held on Friday, 29th of November, 2024, be deferred.
The question is that the minutes of the meeting held on Friday, November 29th, 2024, be now deferred. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Madam President, I am commanded to lay the following documents. The financial statements of the Engineers Registration Board for the fiscal years ending March 31st, 2020, March 31st, 2021, and March 31st, 2022. The audited financial statements of the Grantley Adams International Airport for the year ended March 31st, 2024. The annual report and audited financial statements of Needham Points Development Inc. and Needham Points Holdings Limited for the year ended March 31st, 2023. The medium-term debt management strategy for the fiscal years 2024 to 2025 to 2026, 2027. The Government of Barbados European Investment Bank Country Counter Guarantee Agreement and Standby Finance Contract, Barbados Global Gateway Nature Guarantee.
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate and moved by minister.
Madam President, I beg to move the suspension of Standing Order 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of the day's sitting.
Question is that Standing Order 45-2 be now suspended for the rest of today's sitting. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam President, we note that you are now sitting in that seat, and therefore we will need someone, Madam President, to be able to take up the chair of Deputy President for the remainder of today's sitting. And I beg to move that Senator Andrew Malalou be appointed as Deputy President for the remainder of the day's sitting.
The question is that Senator Andrew Malalou be appointed as Deputy President for the rest of the day's sitting. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. The other side.
Introduction of bills.
Madam President, I beg to give notice of the resolution of the Barbados Fiscal Framework 2024 to 2025 to 2026 to 2027 and 2025 to 2026 to 2027 to 2028 be debated in Parliament, and that any recommendations made in respect of this fiscal framework be considered by the Cabinet. Madam President, I beg to move the first reading of the Maritime and Underwater Heritage Bill 2024 and the first reading of the Tourism Development Amendment Bill 2024.
The question is that what's the question? The question is that the aforementioned bills be now read a first time. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Public business.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Madam President, it is my pleasure as leader of government business, very temporarily, to congratulate you, Madam President, on your ascension to this position, sitting in this chair. We note, Madam President, your already outstanding contributions as Deputy President, and we know that you will deliver and usher us through today's sitting with your usual aplomb and charm, Madam President, and therefore we look forward to having a very productive day sitting. Congratulations to you, Madam President. Madam President, I believe I have a second congratulations to give to you, and that is on your recent national award, Madam President. Madam President, I want to say to you that when I certainly heard your name called, you know, it was an affirmation, Madam President, of what we all know to be in this chamber and nationally as well, the tremendous contribution that you have made in so many spheres and your indelible contribution to government nationally. Madam President, if I begin to call the number of ways that you have stepped up and to assist this country and this government, the list will certainly be long. Your sterling work within the United Nations, your work currently as I'm always plenipotentiary, your work and your leadership for the Prime Minister now as it relates to the Sustainable Development Goals for vulnerable countries as Barbados and the Prime Minister has taken up chairmanship of the V20. We know that you have been appointed as Sherpa for that, your long years of service within the United Nations, Madam President, we have had calls within this honorable chamber to reflect as we have debated and reflected on bills that have been passed related to, again, the environment and climate change, your contribution and the pathway that you have made in those areas, Madam President. And I think that I would speak for all of the honourable senators in here to say that your award was well deserved for your long service, your outstanding service that is well recognized, and one that has left a footprint that I want to say to you that you can be proud of. One that certainly, as a senator coming in myself, that I look upon and reflect upon your style, your mentorship, in so many areas and in so many ways, Madam President, that I want to say to you the most warmest, sincerest, and heartfelt congratulations to you, Madam President. Madam President, I am not very good at all of the adjoining, so I'm going to have to beg now to just make sure that I do all of the salutations correctly. Is it honorable? Most honorable, most honorable, most honorable. Oh, that sounds so good, Madam President, to be able to say most honorable to you. Thank you very much, Madam President, and congratulations.
The chair recognizes Senator Warren.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. And I rise to join with the leader of government business today and to offer congratulations to you on your elevation, the National Award. I can say that you have been a person who, in public life for a number of years, a representative of a constituency, held various ministerial levels, offices, and also your appointment to the United Nations, which was supported by a Democratic Labour Party administration under the Right Honourable Frandl Stewart. So for you to be elevated for a national award, it probably would not come as a surprise to anyone in Barbados. You've served with distinction at the political level and nationally as well. You are a parliamentarian which persons would emulate. I had the privilege of serving with you in the Senate on previous occasions, and your robust debate, your contributions, but at the end of the day, with the maturity of politics, you can see that you are someone who understands politics and the maturity of it. Even though we may have our adversarial debates and conversation, but at the same token, you can still depend on you to speak in the interest of the country and on national issues. So I think that you are most deserving of the award. You have always placed yourself as one of those women within the country which young ladies should look up to, the way that you carry yourself, your manner, the way that you speak. You're very articulate, and these are things that we always want for our young women in this country to emulate, and should always be happy to see a person of your distinction being awarded nationally with the highest national award. And I'm hoping that young women in Barbados would recognize this, and the character that you have in terms of your eloquence, the way you carry yourself, the manner of how you put over your points. These are some things that some young ladies don't seem to think are important, but these are things which are very important and should be emulated and should be recognized within persons in society. So I want to join in congratulating you, the Most Honorable Henrietta Thompson, I believe I got it right, Deputy Speaker of the House, well, of the Deputy President of the Senate, and again, I congratulate you.
Madam Deputy President, if I may join in these messages of congratulations to you. It is with, am I on? Yes. I am particularly pleased for you, ma'am, having been around you for a long time. And for the country to see it fit to bestow you with Barbados' highest national honor, the Order of Freedom, makes sense, in my opinion. Your distinguished career stretches far and wide. We've heard Senator Monroe Knight, we've heard Senator Walters speak of your contribution, and I see throughout the coverage of your elevation that you are being referred to as an international public servant. It doesn't get any bigger than that. It doesn't encapsulate your service any better than that. To be recognized as an international public servant shows the commitment, the level of service, and the class that goes with a Queens College girl, because I had to go there. I went there, Madam Deputy President. Your contribution to the political landscape stretches from 1994 to 2008, where you represented a constituency in St. James South, I believe it was. Your work as Minister of Health, your United Nations service, your special advisor service to the President of the General Assembly from 2013 to 14, and your senior advisor position on sustainable energy from 2014 to 2015. And then in 2018, as you know, you were appointed permanent representative to the United Nations. Now, you know this, but I wish it to go on record. People must understand the scope of your service. And of course, in recent times, you were honored for your contribution to the Parliamentary Reform Commission, where you were, as I understand it, quite active in ensuring that the needs of Parliament and the improvement to Parliament was verbalized. Whether it was taken on board is another thing, but your service in that regard was also stellar. So that those who know ought not to have been surprised. Those who went to Queens College are impressed, but not surprised. We're thrilled. We are thrilled. I'm gonna clap for that. I'm gonna clap for that, myself, as a former Queens College student. It is a pleasure to be able to speak on this matter, ma'am. I would get up and I would bow if I could, but consider, ma'am, that I have bowed before you as one of our most honorable citizens of Barbados. Heartiest congratulations. May God continue to bless you in everything that you do, both personally and on behalf of Barbados. I'm obliged to you, ma'am.
I should like to thank the Chamber for their very kind words. I must tell you that this has been very, very overwhelming. I came to public life quite young. I did not expect to be here so old. There have been many, many ups and many, many downs inside and outside my party at the national level. But the outpouring of support that I have felt from Barbadians of all walks of life has taken me entirely by surprise. You do the best that you can, and I've always done that, and always put Barbados first, even when it has been represented otherwise. Public life becomes quite a lonely place, very, very difficult to make decisions when others present them as wrong. And in these days when the public square is magnified by the technology, and all kinds of persons can say all kinds of things without any degree of censure. It is because my parents gave me a strong rooting of faith that I have been able to stay the course, to use an expression that the Prime Minister uses so frequently, in good times and in bad. In times when I have been at the mountaintop and in times when I have been in the deepest valley, I have journeyed with my God. I want to thank my country. I have been recognized internationally, and I never thought really that I really would see the day that Barbados recognized me. But, you know, I flew into Barbados, received the honor, and flew up the next day to continue national service at the international level. So yes, I've worked internationally, I've worked regionally, but I've always worked in the best interest of this country. I want to thank colleagues in here for putting aside the political divide today to speak kindly about the work and I've done and the contribution I have made, and to say that difficult though it has have seen it fit, who've seen something in me, and other leaders at the national and regional, international and regional level, who've seen it fit to ask me to make contributions to do things for them. I want to thank all the people who taught me at the St. Michael's School. Where I was until 5th form, and then at Queen's College, where I did my A-levels. And I want to close on 2 points. One, by thanking the people of St. James South, without whom I would never have come to national prominence, because it was a difficult constituency, which at the time that I won it had never been won historically by the Barbados Labour Party. So without those people in St. James South thinking that I had something to offer them and to offer the country, and sticking with me over 3 terms, for that I remain perpetually grateful, because that became the platform for regional and international service. I want to thank those close people who are friends, who have helped to keep me grounded over the years. And that is so necessary in public life, where people are saying, yes, Minister, yes, please, don't mind the idiot. You know, it is really very important to have somebody who will say to you, no, Liz, no, I don't think so. That's not what the public wants. Perhaps you want to reflect again. And I want to thank my family. And I know that many of you will understand this, those who have been candidates, those who aspire to be candidates, those who have been the children of candidates, that when you are in public life, your family serves with you. And when you are loved, they are treated kindly. And when the tide turns, believe me, it turns on your family as well. So they triumph and they suffer. And I want to thank my family for standing with me, for holding me up, for praying with me, for encouraging me, and for giving me unconditional love over the years that has allowed me, I think, to be a typical Bajan, born in ordinary circumstances from ordinary parents, and I bless God for my mother and father, and who came to high office because Barbados shaped who I am. So thank you so very much. The truth is, I have been working constantly since November 30th. It was a week after my 63rd birthday, and I am planning to take the next few days to just pause and absorb this, because it was not something that I truly expected. And I'm sorry to be so emotional. And this is a rare moment, believe me. And I'm sorry to have taken so long, but truthfully, it is overwhelming for me, honestly. May God bless you all, and may God always bless Barbados.
Madam Deputy President, if I may just, since we are at this juncture of the proceedings, on the last occasion, I believe, I was not here, but I listened, and I believe that the President would have congratulated Senator Drakes for her having her doctorate conferred upon her in an area related to climate change. You know, that very few people understand, but she does. And what I would like to say at this point, for the record, was I would also like to join with the Chamber in congratulating her, but I would like it to go on the record to let everyone know that which she would not have shared, which is that she was conferred with the doctorate with high commendation. It's very important that people understand that she just doesn't have a doctorate. She has a doctorate with high commendation. And the Chamber would not have been made aware unless I said it, because she was not going to say it because she is humble. I'm obliged to you, Madam Deputy President.
I join in congratulating you, Senator Dr. Drakes, because I was not here on the last occasion, but nobody in here would be surprised that you got a high commendation, because we see the fine mind at work applied in many interesting ways during the course of debate. So sincere congratulations. May God open a path before you in a ways that you would not even have anticipated.
Order number 7, in the name of the Honorable Acting Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Maritime and Underwater Heritage Bill 2024.
Madam President, I'm very happy to be able to lead debate on this particular bill this morning. This bill that we are going to be considering, the Marine and Underwater Heritage Bill, is a comprehensive piece of legislation that for me will set Barbados apart in terms of what it is doing to protect cultural heritage in a comprehensive way. Most of the times when we speak to cultural heritage, we think of it in the normal way that we would think of culture and heritage, in the ways that I speak about it, I'm sure, in this place very often, and how we experience it very often. So we know that when we talk about cultural heritage, we don't think necessarily about the marine cultural heritage, we think about physical heritage that we have. So our physical assets in our buildings, this Parliament, Madam President, is a part of our cultural heritage. We know about the intangible cultural heritage, our customs, our food, our clothes, the way we speak. All of that is part of our intangible cultural heritage. And we know, Madam President, that those are the normal things that we understand, that we speak to, making sure that we value and that we preserve when we talk about cultural heritage. And the government has made several advancements in that sphere of cultural heritage and its preservation. Madam President, I would have spoken already in this honorable chamber about the fact that the government is moving to make sure that we preserve, for instance, the land ship and its movement as being an important part, an indelible part of our cultural heritage, because one of its historical role and what we believe is not only its historical role, but the lessons that can be learned in the contemporary as well, Madam President. We have spoken about the fact that we are moving to ensure that, for instance, that we make road tennis as well recognized as part of our cultural heritage, again, that should be protected. Because again, we know that road tennis is an indigenous sport, Madam President. All of that forms part of what we know and what we speak to as our cultural heritage. But this bill that we will be debating challenges us to move away from what we would normally speak to and also embrace and look at the aspect of marine heritage, which is also important. And that is why I say that this bill then provides a comprehensive frame for how the government is looking at the importance and value of heritage, which is, again, like I said, Madam President, not often addressed. So that this bill provides us with a frame that looks at marine heritage, not only in terms of, yes, its value, but how do we make sure that we pay attention to valuing and leveraging that asset, but in a sustainable way, in a way that allows us as well to marry the economic needs, or the economic imperative, with the social needs and imperative, but also as well the environment imperatives, and making sure that we are able to do so in a way that protects those very assets that are important. So it looks at the fact that, yes, there have been calls all along for us to diversify our tourism product. But diversifying our tourism product means that we can also leverage what we have. So that sun, sea, and sand that we normally see and we normally put out there, but we know that many other countries have sun, sea, and sand. But then the question is, again, how do we leverage? And in this case, how do we leverage those assets, those cultural heritage assets within our sea and our coast? And importantly, Madam President, this bill looks at both what we in culture would call the tangible and intangible cultural heritage assets. So when we talk about the tangible cultural assets within the context of this bill, of course, Madam President, I would be honest and say I did not know that we had so many shipwrecks across Barbados. And that is part of the cultural heritage that this bill is also seeking to, one, build awareness of and also protect. Madam President, I became aware, and I am going to be very honest, just from doing research on this bill, that there's actually a shipwreck, I think somewhere off Carlisle Bay, that dates back to 1919. It was a ship that was used in the First World War, and that was sunk here from 1919. And then, Madam President, and I tell the truth, I didn't remember it. I think there's one of the that's called the Bajan Queen. I don't know if everybody remembers the Bajan Queen party boat. Madam President seems to be having some memories of the Bajan Queen party boat, exactly off Carlisle Bay, which we sunk again as a treasure. I think it was in 2022. 2022 or 2002, earlier, Madam President. So we have a number of shipwrecks, and that counts as part of the tangible marine heritage that we have. But there are other parts of it. So we talk about that intangible cultural heritage, which speaks again to the traditions and the folklores that have to do with the sea. And we know we grow up, Madam President, we know we hear the sea ain't got in the back door. And you know, there are people who can tell you, you know, when the sea rough and how far you're supposed to go, Madam President. the fisher folk as well, very attuned to the changes of the sea and what is happening and where it will be rough. And then also as well what kind of fish can be caught in what waters, etc. So that is part of the intangible marine heritage that this bill also as well speaks to. So not only recognizing just the tangible assets as well, but also that intangible cultural heritage, that intangible marine cultural heritage. But importantly, Madam President, if we look at the bill, if you look at section 9.1, when it talks about sustainable tourism principles, again, that challenge that we have as we talk about that transition that we need to be able to make, and we talk about the green and blue economy, we know that there are challenges. Because if we want, again, to, as some people would say, exploit those resources, what does that mean when we talk about that and how we treat to those? How do we exploit resources in a way that will make sure that communities and people are able still to benefit and that it doesn't have ecological damage as well? So that section 9.1, Madam President, and at 2, and it says that all persons engaged in these tourism-related activities shall make sure that it take into account the existing and future economic, social, and environmental impacts, the needs of locals and visitors, Madam President, which is important because you know that the mantra for this government has always been that the first tourist is a local. So that this bill also as well recognizes, and again, that this is not only just about tourists who will be able to come and enjoy, but also as well recognizing that locals also as well need to be able to enjoy, and therefore that we need to be able to preserve and to protect. And it talks again that, that those persons engaged in those tourism-related activities shall make sure that they take into account of the marine heritage sector, the environment, and make sure that they promote responsible marine heritage practices that will minimize marine environmental damage and reduce the carbon footprint and so on. But Madam President, this bill also speaks to the fact that we will have shipping vessels that will be coming through our waters, Madam President, and that in doing so, that they will have to discharge some effluent that may cause damage. So that this bill also recognizes that notion that there has to be some level of a regulatory framework that addresses this. And this is why this piece of this proposed bill is so important, because it was a regulatory framework that was missing essentially to make sure that we can, and it is a principle, Madam President, that we speak to in relation to climate negotiations, of the polluter pays. Yeah? We have just come back, Madam President, we were together in Azerbaijan. And this notion of the polluter pays was one of the principles that was signaled in the negotiations. The acknowledgement that if you have caused harm, then you have to be able to take responsibility for that harm and address it and do some level of repair as well. So that the bill recognizes, yes, the tourists that would come and do the diving activities, but also as well shipping vessels that move through our waters and the potential damage that can occur. And it's saying to all of us that there needs to be some level of responsibility placed, Madam President, to ensure that we can have the level of sustainability in the context of the use of our marine heritage resources as well. Madam President, I want to also as well speak to the fact that when we talk about marine heritage and we look at activities that are happening near the coast as well, that we also need to be cognizant of those areas. And in particular, Madam President, I want to reflect here that we've had some discussions, again, just in terms of how do we make sure that we build out an integrated frame. so that this bill should not be taken in one part by itself, but that this bill also sits alongside other suites of legislation and other pieces of policies that have been identified for the government. So one of those is the Marine Spatial Plan. And the Marine Spatial Plan as well takes into consideration that we need to be able to have a framework which brings all of the stakeholders together in order to plan for developments that will take place across our marine environment, our coastal environment, Madam President, as well, and to make sure, again, that we have a full balance of all of those concerns that I spoke to as well. How do we balance, again, the economic, the social, and the environment as well? But it also, as well, Madam President, sits alongside all other international agreements that we've also acceded to, so that it sits alongside, Madam President, the UN Convention for the Law of the Seas, which is an important framework for us to be able to have an overarching acknowledgement, again, that countries have to be responsible, again, for their actions relative to the marine environment. It also, as well, finds context within the UNESCO Convention as well for underwater heritage, again, which Barbados also as well acceded to in 2001 and we ratified in 2008. So this concern is not a new one, it is a recognized one, but this piece of legislation now provides a comprehensive frame for us to make sure that we have the necessary protection. And that is important, Madam President. And so that within this bill, you would see, again, coverage not only, again, for leisure, but also for research activities, scientific endeavors, as well as commercial pursuits as well. It therefore provides, Madam President, essentially a one-stop shop, again, to be able to cover all of those activities. But when we look at the bill, you would note that one of the things that the bill does is also recognizes that the protection of the marine environment does not necessarily only fit within the confines of the Ministry of Tourism, but also as well it speaks to a number of other players. So you would see references in the bill, Madam President, to even the Barbados Museum as well. You will find reference as well, Madam President, even to the Customs Department, because again, the bill speaks to the fact that the Customs Department has a role in making sure that it protects and establishes a regime that it can monitor the exportation of those marine cultural heritage assets that people would want to take. And again, Madam President, because we don't value them, and if we do not have legislation that speaks to protecting them, we may lose them and not even be aware. So that when people and tourists are sometimes having in their bag pieces of coral that they shouldn't break off, Madam President, but they want to take home, as part of something from Barbados, this regime now says to Customs and others, you have to be on the lookout for that, Madam President. But it also speaks not only to the exportation, but because we can't just protect ourselves, but the fact that we also need to be able to be part of a family, a global family that recognizes the value of this issue, but also as well ask Customs to make sure that it is mindful of the importation of those assets as well. And that importation is also important, again, for the protection of the regime. So again, recognizing that this legislation will cover a number of entities that need to be able to work together to make sure that we have the comprehensive regime that is necessary as well. One of the elements, Madam President, of this bill that you will see as we work through the various clauses of the bill. Clause 10, for instance, establishes a marine heritage tourism development program, which is an important component, because we are not just saying, let's have a piece of legislation which is just providing a regime for protection, but because government understands the value of this. Actually, Madam President, heritage tourism is worth, Madam President, currently they tell me, over, I believe it is, $600 billion globally. $600 billion globally, with projections showing significant growth to reach over $800 billion by 2033. That is the value of heritage, of the global heritage tourism, of which the marine heritage tourism is part. So that the government, in this bill, in the establishment of that program, is recognizing that we need to be able to build out a frame that will then monitor, that will then speak to how we actually practically implement, how we are able to follow up and make sure that we have the necessary coherence that is needed in order to bring this bill to life. But it then also says at clause 11 that that program will be based on a cultural heritage development plan, Madam President, a cultural heritage development plan. And that is important. And it notes as well that the minister responsible for tourism, in consultation with the administration and any other governmental or non-governmental organizations, including the private sector, with an interest in matters pertaining to the Marine Historical Heritage Tourism Development Plan, Mr. President. So it speaks to the fact that there is an acknowledgement, again, that this is not just a government program or plan that will be developed, but that we understand that there are other critical stakeholders that need to be brought to the table in the development of this plan and the ownership of the plan as well. And so that it expressly, Madam President, indicates the involvement of a wide set of stakeholders and indicates the areas that the plan shall speak to, Madam President. And I want to note, Madam President, that at 11.2G, it talks about providing a framework for national development opportunities deriving from maritime heritage and the development of a maritime heritage sector as well. So that speaks again to the long term. And at this, again, it's not just a piece of legislation, again, like I said, that we are doing without having the pillars that are necessary to make sure that the plan continues, that the plan is shored up, and more importantly, Madam President, that the plan is owned by the relevant stakeholders, again, which is critical. Madam President, if we look at clauses 12 to 29, we would note, Madam President, this is very interesting. And again, it speaks to the comprehensive nature of this bill. It speaks to lighthouses across Barbados. Again, something that we don't value, don't take note of. And Madam President, I was trying to research my memory, and I don't think that I was born around that time where lighthouses were in use and those. I only have memories of areas that I passed. I see other members of the Honorable Chamber looking up my side and perhaps suggesting that they have those memories. But what the bill speaks to, Madam President, and this is the important part of cultural preservation that we don't often appreciate. So the bill indicates, again, in those clauses, that persons cannot destroy and change and go and make alterations to those lighthouses that will again erode its significance as a part of our cultural heritage. And it is important, and it reminded me, and Senator King is here, is that within the Division of Culture, one of the projects that we are doing is a National Heritage Register as well, a register of significant places. And I know that we've added recently windmills to that as well. And that attempt is to be able to document all of those sites and places, because our memory of those are going. Madam President, I am moved to note that just this year alone, we have experienced such significant loss by people across so many different areas who would have played critical roles in a number of different spheres. And if we are not careful to be able to document those memories and those significant things, we will have generations who would come behind us and not be aware and not understand. So that this is also fundamentally about cultural identity and knowing who we are. By saying within the context of this bill, that goes so far as to recognize the intangible cultural heritage that is within the lighthouses that we have remaining across Barbados, and the need to make sure that we preserve them, and the need to make sure that we protect them as well. The bill also as well makes sure that we have the registration, again, of historic vessels as part of a Barbados Historic Vessels Registry Program, Madam President. So that those like me that can't remember or don't recall, again, all of those shipwrecks and that we've had across the island that would not have a recollection, again, of those historic vessels that may also be passing through, that we now would have an established registry that would allow us, Madam President, to be able to do so and manage, again, under the Barbados Maritime Transport Administration in consultation with the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And I spoke to it before, Madam President, but if we look at clauses 30 to 69, and that speaks again to the intangible cultural heritage aspect, which again is important. And it speaks to the recognition that there is marine-specific traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions associated with the sea and the maritime natural heritage in the form of marine genetic resources as well, and the importance of fishing communities, Madam President, which is critical as well. Because very often, and we have this, Madam President, again, within the larger cultural sphere. I was at a meeting just yesterday, again, talking to cultural practitioners, and the notion that the basket weavers that we have, the people that are involved in pottery, Madam President, we don't find a signal place for them because they're a little bit unseen, even though they are an important part, again, of that cultural tapestry. And we see the fishing communities, only, yes, as the fisher folk, which are important to go out, but there is a complete ecosystem that exists within fishing communities that this bill recognizes that we need to be able to give value to those voices and those traditions that happen. And I'm happy to say, again, under the Division of Culture, again, one of the things that we've been talking about is how do we resuscitate that tradition of making the fishing nets, Madam President, and doing training, again, so that that also is not a lost art, Madam President. Again, within the bill, it asks the Tourism Ministry to make sure that it promotes the protection and sustainable utilization of maritime heritage assets, Madam President. It ensures, it asks as well that we have, as I said, make sure that we have social recognition of those coastal communities and for their participation in research or development activities, again, which is important. Madam President, I've come, as most of you would know, from the NGO community. And very often, one of the things that would happen when people are coming in to do research activities is that they would come and, they would do interviews and focus groups, very often with the knowledge bearers. Very often, the value of their research and whatever else comes out of their research is not passed on. So they come in, they take, but it is not passed on. So there's a recognition that we need to make sure that we have the level of participation and interaction and engagement by those communities, and not in an instrumental way, but also as well in a very real way as well. The bill, Madam President, also as well, as I said before, as it finds its place within the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas, which provides at Article 33 and Article 303, provides measures to protect against the unlawful removal and trafficking in objects of archaeological and historical nature found at sea. The unlawful removal and trafficking. And I saw that, Madam President, again, did a little bit of research. Again, because we are accustomed to, when we talk about trafficking, whether that is people, we know in some jurisdictions, again, there are animals, husks and skins that are trafficked. But have we ever thought about, again, the value of our marine underwater heritage? It could be so valued that people don't just want to take it and put it in their suitcases as a memory of Barbados, but that now it becomes something that is transactional, sold on a market, and therefore can potentially become endangered, Madam President. And so this legislation takes all of that into consideration in its comprehensiveness as well. It looks at the state responsibilities to make sure that we do everything that is possible for us to be able, again, to make sure that the aspects of this bill that need strong implementation are done so. It actually has, Madam President, Section 200 that speaks specifically to the state responsibilities, that make sure that we conduct according to specific standards as well, that all of the specific standards that relate to the area and the ocean mineral activities adheres to the requirements and standards established by general principles of international law. It makes sure it asks the state not to impose unnecessary, disproportionate, or duplicate regulatory burden on parties, nor impose requirements upon a sponsored party in a way that then contravenes other international conventions, but also as well would prevent the widest level of participation and protection for this heritage resource. So, Madam President, again, I believe that this bill is comprehensive, that this bill provides a sufficient basis for the government and essentially for the nation to make sure that we can protect what has traditionally been an undervalued heritage resource, a resource that we have not prioritized or thought about. This bill brings attention to it and creates the framework that it sits alongside what we are already doing under the broad ambit of culture and heritage, and recognizes the synergies that need to be made to make sure, again, that as a country, we understand the holistic frame that is culture and heritage, so that when we speak to it now, we understand the inclusion of marine heritage as essential. Madam Chair, with those few words, I beg to move that this bill be passed, that this bill be not read a second time.
Senator Worrell, please.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. And it is Christmas, and I rise to make a contribution in this debate of the Maritime Heritage Bill. Pardon? Okay, and just from the outset to let you know that there is nothing contentious really in this bill that we see not to support the legislation, but there are just a few concerns that we would want to raise as we go through the legislation. We recognize that it is a work in progress for the government, and in terms of our maritime heritage, which the leader of government business, Senator Chantal Monroe-Knight, did go into great detail with the heritage aspect of it, which can also contribute to our tourism and the history of our country. As we speak about maritime heritage, let's deal with the easy parts first. I find that as a country surrounded by water, I find that many Barbadians are still afraid of the sea. And that old adage that the sea has no back door, which is something which I would like to see change within this country. If you go to other Caribbean territories, you find that persons exploit the sea a bit more than Barbados, especially places like St. Lucia. Outside of our fishing communities, we don't really have many Barbadians who get into marine life. In terms of owning a boat and just using it for pleasure for Barbadians and not necessarily pleasure for tourists. And it would be good to see a bit more of that happening with Barbadians utilizing the sea as an opportunity for more pleasure craft, not just for partying, which we are very good at, but for recreational purposes as well. Why can't the average person have a boat and on weekends sail the west coast of Barbados? You have the Round the Island Regatta, which happens on Arrow Day, you know, and persons would actually come out to watch the boat sailing around Barbados. I would really like to see more young people in Barbados being actively involved in that aspect of life and utilize the marine space which we have. Now, the bit unsexy part of it is fishing, because we seem to think that fishing is not important, but it really is. And to some extent, it is, some people view fishermen as not necessarily of the same status, but you do earn a good living from fishing in any jurisdiction. If you go to places like Canada, you have persons who their only job is fishing probably for 6 months of the year when the weather condition is good, and that is their life. And they earn a substantial amount of money from it that, you know, for the other 6 months of the year, they're able to take care of themselves. And I believe that it is high time that we elevate fishing in Barbados to that level and not just fish in the nearshore waters. And we do have fishermen who, they try to trace the flying fish and end up in Tobago and other areas. But as we all know from the sustainability loan, we have an exclusive marine environment which extends out to the east coast of the island, which is not necessarily heavily utilized by our fishermen, because to some extent the vessels which they use would not necessarily permit you to go to that level in terms of, you have the longliners which go for probably 3 to 6 weeks at a time if they're able to. majority of the longliners would love to go for the 3 weeks, but or 6 weeks, but end up coming back into shore because of problems with either the engine or some aspect of the boat. And then the accommodation as well too for the young fishermen who are on those longliners is not very appealing to most persons, because obviously when you're out there for that period of time, you don't have access to the communication technology in terms of being able to go on the internet, use WhatsApp and stay in contact with your family. Now with technology, some boats can be outfitted with the Starlink internet system, which would allow these boats to remain in communication and allow the persons working on these vessels to have access to WhatsApp, or even to download movies to watch at night when they're not fishing. Those are the kind of things that would help to increase the level in terms of making fishing more appealing to more young persons. Because not everybody is built to be away from your family for 3 weeks and not have access to the modern communication which you're accustomed to at home. And you can then see our fishing boats being developed to the level of trawlers, where they can go out and stay out for a longer period of time, having the processing done on the boats as well, so that when they come back into land, the fish is ready for the market or ready for export. And we do have quite a bit of our longliners who do fish and export the majority of the tuna which they catch outside of Barbados, and it does contribute to the foreign exchange earned by the country. And I would like to see the day when fishing is again at that level. It would have happened years ago, back in the 80s and the 90s, where fishing was so important that it was one of the indicators mentioned when the governor of the central bank at the time gave their economic review. I know to some extent that we in Barbados have not capitalized on the markets available with fishing as some of our regional neighbors, such as St. Lucia, to some extent, in terms of being able to export fish to the EU market through neighboring Martinique and Guadeloupe. We have not really tapped into that market here in Barbados. And this is all relevant to this debate today, because part of this heritage is capturing the stories of the fisher folk and documenting that and making it part of the heritage. And I'm certain that the fishermen from all over Barbados have experience and techniques which they're willing to share, because the way that we fish here may not be the same that it is done in St. Lucia. The fish that we go after, because we utilize the flying fish here, but in Trinidad, they don't really have much of an appetite for flying fish. So that is also an important cultural heritage to share. With regard to sea eggs as well, we missed out. Many of young Barbadians missed out on that opportunity to know what sea eggs taste like, or even to have the opportunity, those in those fishing communities, to go diving for sea eggs, and that experience as well, because of the ban. In other Caribbean territories, they may be there in abundance because they're not being utilized by the persons in those areas. So all of those are aspects of the heritage which we need to capture and document and share with persons as well. And it can also tie in to our tourism product, because something that I envision, you do have the day boats which go fishing, which are chartered by tourists to go for that fishing experience. I'm thinking that there's also another experience which they may be glad to have, the opportunity to go out for a week or so on a regular fishing boat and interact with those persons as well. These are things that can be developed as tourism products, and also can help to develop additional business streams and opportunities for the average Barbadian who lives within a fishing community, along with getting more of our young people actively utilizing the sea in terms of scuba diving, all of those things. Surfing is something that not many young Barbadians are interested in or get involved in, and there are not a lot of unique activities which we can hopefully be able to develop and create additional opportunities and avenues for young persons. Within the marine heritage as well, there's also the opportunity for construction opportunities. Because if you're utilizing more boats, you would need persons who are able to build those boats, who are able to repair those boats as well. So there are new job opportunities. I know that there is the Marine College in Jamaica. How many of our Barbadians actually see that as an avenue in which they can go into the Marine College, or actually learn how to pilot a boat other than a pleasure craft? That is something that we should also be looking to as well. Within the UK, something that you will see persons converting barges into homes. We are a densely populated island with a wonderful marine space. Maybe that may be a possibility too, in terms of utilizing boat homes. Obviously, you would have to find security for those boats in during the hurricane season, but it is done for the yachts and other vessels, so it can also be done if it is looked at as a way of possible housing for some persons as well. But in terms of capturing the heritage, we also need to have the archival capacity as well. And I'm hoping that the minister could provide us with a bit of an update to the status of the situation at the archives in Barbados when the minister wraps up this debate. Could give us an update of the status of the archives. You know that we had the fire there a couple months ago, and many Barbadians saw it as a tragic loss, and it would be good to know the extent to the loss and what is being done to protect the information which is still there, and also what is being done as well to make sure that you capture all of this information that through this legislation you are now seeking to make part of our national heritage, marine heritage. How do you plan to go about it? Again, it provides training opportunities for young people and possible job opportunities as well in terms of being able to capture that information. We never got to hear the full extent of the damage, the details of the damage, and to some extent, some Barbadians think that the archive is closed because of the fire. So whether or not it is still in operation and it is still available for persons to go there to do their research, it would be good to hear an update on that, and also what measures have been put in place to prevent, well, for security of the area and the important cultural heritage artifacts which are there as well. Now, going on into this debate, I am asking the question if this legislation is somehow tied to the Debt for Nature resolution which was done. I think that was in 2023 or 2022. So is this legislation somehow tied to that Debt to Nature, the Blue Bond loans which this government entered in 2022, where part of the component for that would be to reserve 30% of Barbados's marine space as a nature sanctuary, and that would equate to 55,000 square kilometers. Now, if that is the case, and this bill is part and parcel with that, or part of the process, we need to hear how do we intend to police that 55,000 square kilometers. Because as I mentioned, that is way more than the land mass of Barbados, which is only 424 square kilometers. So we're now looking at 55,000 square kilometers. And I think that we need to have that very real conversation. What are the practical steps that we will take in terms of being able to adequately police that and bring Barbadians into that conversation so that those who utilize the marine environment can be a part of that conversation and contribute their ideas as well as to how it can be done. Where exactly will this area of space be located? And then the importance of protecting that marine environment as well. What are some of the things that would cause damage to that marine environment? In terms of pollution, what are we doing to minimize the pollution on the West Coast? Now, we would have had debate in terms of upgrading the South Coast Sewage Plant, but what is being done on the West Coast in terms of protecting the coral reefs on the west coast of the island from pollution as well, because just as important as the South Coast Sewage Plant is, there's also a need for a plant on the West Coast, especially if you are building out more and more tourism products, hotels, villas, and more activities on the West Coast. There is a need for us to be looking at a West Coast sewage treatment plant. So how soon is this government willing to have that conversation, and in terms of identifying the funding for such a plant? And what are the actual numbers in terms of the nitrate levels in the water on the West Coast as well? All of these things we need to know so that we can understand what we are doing to protect our marine environment. You can't also talk about wanting to protect an environment, but you're not trying to also conserve it or to go after persons who damage it as well. We do know that during the COVID period, boats, cruise vessels were anchored off the coast of Barbados, and these vessels did damage the reefs. What I'm asking the minister is to give some update as to what is being done in terms of restoring the reefs which were damaged. What is the plan, agenda, what is the program for that in terms of restoring the reef which was damaged? The coral reefs around Barbados, very important to the fishing community, very important to protecting the coastline as well from excessive, well, during the hurricane season as well. So we need to know what is being done in terms of protecting those reefs, and what is being done. It is not just in terms of the damage, but reef protection and regeneration should be an ongoing program which we enter in as a country, because the reefs are very important. You don't want a situation where you have the glass bottom boats going out, but there's really nothing for you to see. You don't want a situation where the Atlantis submarine is going out and there's nothing for you to see because of the damage to the reef. There's no fish there and all of those things. You need to enhance that environment. And yes, in terms of the adding additional vessels, when you sink the vessels, I think that the Trident was one which was sunk a few years ago in terms of helping to build that reef. Yes, we can do things like that, but there also needs to be other activities being done to enhance and show up our marine space, because it's not only important to tourism, it's also important to fishing as well. We can also add the question too of invasive species, where you had the lionfish, which is an invasive species which would kill off quite a number of our, the fish in our nearshore water. You know, I know that there has been a campaign where divers go out, capture those fish, and also utilize them in restaurants as well. But we must recognize that with climate change, you would have species which are not common to our area coming in and invading our territory. And we must be prepared for that. All of that is also part of the conservation effort and developing the ability to actually police these areas as well. Now, the bill also focuses on marine biotechnology, and this is indeed an area which is poised for additional exploration and can also prove to have some economic benefit for the country as well. I do know that at the University of the West Indies, some of the lecturers or the professors in the natural science department have done some research in terms of utilizing various marine species and examining for the chemical properties to see if there is any medicinal value in the chemical properties of either plant, coral, and other environment. So this is an area that is poised for additional exploration and something which the country should, because they always say that we don't have much natural resources, but we just have to be, the ones that we do have, we have to exploit them to the fullest potential. And that is an area that we should be driving additional research in to identify those areas for biotechnology as well. Now, we also have the issue, years ago, there was the potential for offshore oil drilling in Barbados. We have not heard much from this administration with regard to that, and it would be interesting to know if that is something that has been given up on, or if at some point in time, we would be again looking to see that as an area to help the economy in terms of the exploration for offshore mineral resources, oil in particular. Is that an area that this government will be looking into, or have you, or has the government given up on that? It would be interesting to hear from the government what are the next steps in terms of bringing that to a reality. We've seen that Guyana, they have gone off with it in a major way and is contributing tremendously to the economy in Guyana. So I think that we do need a boost here in Barbados because it is not as rosy as the administration would like us to think. We are just seeing borrowings, but we are not necessarily seeing the economic activity being generated, which would allow for the repayment of those loans when they are due. So any activity which can boost.
On a point of order, Madam President.
What is your point of order?
Madam President, for the honourable member to indicate that the government is engaging in borrowing loans and not generating the activity so as to be able to repay them is not only untrue and misleading, but far from reality. Anyone looking at the country can see the incredible growth that the country is having. Our GDP has increased, and therefore the country is now in a very comfortable position so as to do so in not only the short term, medium term, and long terms. So let the record reflect.
Continue, please, Senator Worrell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President.
With accuracy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. I was really going to say that I was going to avoid the visit of Ebenezer Scrooge, but anyhow, it is Christmas as I started from the beginning, and with accuracy, we are seeing the government borrowing, but we are not necessarily seeing the level of economic activity that gives Barbadians the confidence that when these loans are due for repayment, especially many of them are foreign loans, that the government has the capacity to repay those loans. So I hope that that would be the level of accuracy, Madam Deputy President, and which you so eloquently wish for me to speak with. But it is the major point, every opportunity to develop additional economic activity in Barbados, to move the economy away from this one engine of tourism would be beneficial to the country. So I'm asking the question if there's any real potential for offshore exploration of oil in Barbados, which will create an additional economic sector in the country. And I'm also asking the question as well, what is the government's intention of making this legislation beneficial to the people of Barbados and also in contributing to the economic development of the country? And for explanation, these are the conversations that the people of Barbados want to hear, so that you know what opportunities are available. These are the conversations that you need to inspire our young people, so that they would recognize that there are jobs out there other than being a doctor, other than being a lawyer, other than being an accountant, that there are other fields in which you can aspire to. And it is important for the government of the day to have that high-level conversation with the nation, so that it doesn't make sense passing or introducing a bit of legislation, but the people don't know how to utilize that piece of legislation for their own growth and development. So that is simply the point that I'm trying to put over from the opposition side, to hopefully inspire the government to do something to give people in Barbados hope. But if it is beyond their capacity, well, we know what needs to be done. But that is the level of debate which Barbadians are interested in hearing, knowing that legislation is being passed and then being told how they can utilize that legislation to make a difference in their lives, and how that legislation will make a difference in the country. There's tremendous potential in this, but unless it is unlocked, and unless people know how to utilize it, it will just be another piece of legislation on our books, which is not being utilized, which is not being properly implemented. The question about how do you intend to police 55,000 square kilometers of ocean space is a very important question, because it is part of the terms of a loan which you entered into, and it is due by 2030. This is 2024, heading quickly to 2025. So you have really another 5 years. And you will obviously need Barbadians to have the technical capacity in order to help you to police that 55,000 square kilometers. So I would really like to know how you intend to do it. How will it be done? What technology you would need to have in place? Would you need to have persons who are capable of operating drones, which would go out into that area to make sure, and a series of boys in the area to make sure that if it is an area where no vessels are supposed to be, that nobody is there. If there's supposed to be a registration process in terms of asking fishermen to do a register of their fishing route, or you're having an area where there's supposed to be no fishing, that all of these are things that we need to have conversation with the people of Barbados, and not at the late stage where it becomes almost a burden for it to be implemented. Have the conversation early, bring in the stakeholders so that they can participate in the planning process, and have adequate time that they would know what changes they need to make to their routine in order to get it done. Now, with regard to fishing and the same 55,000 square kilometers, is this legislation looking to restrict fishermen in terms of not being able to use nets in certain areas? and not being able to fish in certain zones as well. All of these are things that will need to be discussed and properly planned so that persons can reorganize the way how they go about their business and the way how, so that the project, when implemented, can be implemented successfully. Madam Deputy President, as I said, the legislation does not find anything that we will challenge or not necessarily agree with, but the area would come in terms of the implementation of the legislation, and we would want to hear from the government how they intend to put the policies in place to appropriately implement this legislation. And with those few words, I thank you.
I thank you too, Senator. Other speakers, please. Senator Drakes, Dr. Drakes, please.
Thank you, Madam President. This piece of legislation that is before this honorable chamber is really a special and unique piece of legislation. It is 269 pages long, but if you are someone who's interested in the blue economy, maritime affairs, the sustainable development of the marine environment, it is good fodder for you. And I'm here aside, Madam President. Okay, I will continue. But I want to first start by recognizing two individuals. I have not made you aware of this, Madam President, but I think it is important to do things like this. I want to make special mention of Miss Najla King, who's an international maritime lawyer, who does significant work in relation to the modernizing of our maritime laws here in Barbados. She's an extremely hardworking and dedicated individual, and I know that what is before us is testimony of her dedication to maritime law in Barbados. And the second individual, Madam President, is our Chief Fisheries Officer, Dr. Shelly-Ann Cox, extremely bright and passionate individual who, if you've ever met her, she eats, sleeps, and breathes fisheries. So I want to commend those two individuals for their work so far in the attempt to modernizing our maritime laws. Madam President, the bill addresses, yes, tangible and intangible, but I want to focus this afternoon on the intangible aspects of cultural heritage as it relates to the marine space. And I want to do so because usually it is such a hard concept to grasp, to manage, to qualify and quantify in a way that people can understand and we can make decisions about it, because you don't have a sense of what you're dealing with because of its intangible nature. And in addition to that, it deals with underwater heritage. Dare I ask how many honorable members in this chamber have gone underwater in Barbados? I'm seeing two, literally, more than 20 feet below sea level. It seems like there's a minority in the chamber. So these unseen things, Madam President, are also somewhat aloof to the average Barbadians because they don't know, they don't see, they don't interact with it. And because we don't interact with it, there is a tendency sometimes for it to go under the radar, and we don't value it as we should, as was recognized by the leader of government business in her presentation. But I also want to note that when we talk about the intangibles and cultural heritage and marine cultural heritage, in relation to sustainability, even globally, culture is an afterthought. Culture is an afterthought. And many persons who study, practice in the area are starting to recognize that we are failing in our attempt to arrest and address the global climate crisis is because what we're trying to change is not technology. What we're trying to change is not even the economic system. It is not how we deal with environmental issues. But what we're actually trying to change, or what has to change for all of those other things to get the results that we want, is culture. It is the value system that people have with the environment. And that is one of the hardest things to do in the current context of what we know as the capitalist society that drives a lot of the value system that we operate day in and day out with. And that is just a fact. That is just a fact, Madam President. It is such an afterthought in the discussion around culture, is such an afterthought, particularly in the maritime space, that even in Sustainable Development Goal number 14, Life Below Water, there's no mention of ocean culture. There's absolutely no mention of ocean culture. The Pacific Islands have done tremendous work in putting culture and sustainability on the table as it relates to ocean preservation and regeneration. And I want to say I commend Barbados for bringing this bill to the chamber this afternoon, because it sends a signal that in the Caribbean, we are prepared to be the thought leaders in this area of maritime heritage, Madam President. Ma'am, what I want to do is bring to the chamber's attention a document, and I'll make this a document of the House, is a thesis done by a master's student at the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies here in Barbados, CERMES. The author is Mr. Clish Gittins, who's a colleague of mine in the NGO space. And he did some seminal work in this area. I'm not sure if the government is even aware of this piece of research. But the title of the research was The Ocean and Our Culture, the characterization of the cultural benefits derived from the marine environment in Barbados using a cultural ecosystems services approach. And lo and behold, in that thesis, it found that in the coastal communities of Sixmens, Bats Rock, and Silver Sands, the coastal environment was instrumental and foundational to the cultural identity of both individuals and communities in those spaces. That type of research is directly related to the legislation that we are discussing today. In that study, it states it is evident that there's a dynamic relationship that occurs between people and the natural environment, which produces cultural benefits. Identity in each case study being the 3 research sites, is a central cultural benefit that is enabled, reinforced, or altered based on the practices that people engage in those areas. So there's a recognition, even in the research community, that there is a harmony that needs to occur between what is happening culturally and what is happening at the community level, as well as the environmental and the ecological systems. For us to get to the point where we can comfortably say we are moving in a sustainable, or we are moving towards a sustainable path. But I want to ask a question given what I've laid out already. Based on this current legislation, how does it pair with the physical development plan? How does this piece of legislation empower those communities or members of the community in an area like 6 Mins in light of the development of the Pendry Hotel that is going to be their neighbor? How does this give life and breath to their rights as cultural practitioners, the holders of the untold stories, that intangible heritage of the 6 Mins community, in light of how the development that is currently ongoing and any future development puts at risk that heritage? And that is the type of conversation that we have to have in relation to pieces of legislation like this. Because this is how this becomes real for people at the community level. I can ask another question. How does this legislation pair with the villa development at Joes River in St. Joseph? Given that there's clearly strong community connection to the area, and the development seems to be at odds with the cultural benefits that are derived in that community. So this piece of legislation has real implications for how we look at overall development, what weight we give to economic incentives and economic development, and what weight we give to preserving and conserving the values of communities, and what it intrinsically means to be Barbadian. And what does that look like, and how is that shaped in a 21st century context, where we, yes, need foreign investment, we need to service our debt, we need to do all these things to ensure our macroeconomic situation is stable, but at the same time ensure that we do not lose what it means to be Barbadian. And that is the constant tension as a small island developing state, and what we now know, or what we call them now as large ocean states, have to contend with as we move forward in making decisions about our coastal and marine environment. Madam Deputy President, Madam President, today, I want to also highlight, based on those questions that I've raised, Clause 40 and Clause 232. Clause 40 speaks to the designation of community custodian. And the legislation reads, upon recommendation by the Chief Fisheries Officer, the minister responsible for coastal and marine affairs may, by order, designate a coastal community or fishing community as a community custodian. Clause 232, which is in Part 7, speaks to a citizens' impact and benefit sharing committee. So based on these two areas, I assume there is some recognition that in the governance framework, and I'm seeing nodding on the other side, in the governance framework, the need to have local community engagement in the decision-making about the development of our marine and coastal environment. And it is critical because those communities are the ones with the knowledge, the indigenous knowledge with the local knowledge. They are the ones who will deeply understand how any development that moves forward will impact the culture in that space. And what I will say and go even further with is that this Citizens Impact and Benefit Sharing Committee is not specified in terms of how members will be chosen, what type of decision-making power do they have? How are they integrated, for instance, into the PDP process, the physical development process and regulation? I think that needs to be addressed, fine-tuned, and articulated by the government, because having it in the legislation is a good start, but in order for those types of governance instruments at the local level to have teeth, we have to figure out the way by which we integrate them to give them legitimacy in the decision-making process. There have been calls about and I'm switching gears here. There have been calls as it relates to the damage that was done by the cruise ships during the pandemic to the coral reefs here in Barbados. That damage was just about the size of the Bridgetown area, the equivalent of it. I don't have the exact number, so I don't want to state right now the exact number. But the damage that was done was about the size of the Bridgetown area to the coral reefs. We come to this place to pass legislation so that it can be implemented and executed by the relevant agencies. There is legislation on the books that allows for compensation of the damage of reefs. However, I do not think to date that legislation has ever been used. I do not want to be a part of a legislature that passes laws for them to sit on shelves, for us to stand and pontificate about how lovely the legislation is. But then when it gets to the executing agencies, nothing is being done, because what we will be doing is wasting time. Madam President, I am saying this afternoon that, one, the damage that was done, obviously the restoration or recovery could never have been started in a significant way, because we all know that coral takes thousands of years to reproduce. And secondly, the people of Barbados were never compensated for that damage. If we are saying we're doing that for nature swaps, we are developing blue-green banks, we are establishing the marine spatial plan, we have to get serious about how we execute and implement ecological preservation and the penalties that go with anyone who commits an offense to our ecological assets. So, with those very short few words, Madam President, I commend this bill to the Chamber. It has my support. There are some other areas in here that I would ask some questions about later on in committee, and maybe I'll raise it now. The idea that any type of research done in a coastal community has to have the permit or be given a permit needs to be relooked. If a student at Barbados Community College goes into Skeets Bay and asks questions about anything related to the coastal environment, they may not know what are the implications set out in this legislation. But a fine of up to $100,000, we need to make sure that we are not conflating large research efforts or grants, which have millions of dollars associated with them, that may come from international agencies, and local researchers who are just doing their best to try to pass exams and get work done. I think there needs to be a distinction about what type of research we're targeting as it relates to the permits and how research is done in coastal communities. And that's something we can discuss in committee. But I wanted to flag that as an area that maybe more thought needs to go into it, because I would not want us to stifle research where every single individual who wants to do a piece of work or a piece of research or a study in a coastal community or the nearshore environment, for instance, has to go and get a permit. If they don't get the permit, they run contravention of the law. So that is an area I think we can have a further discussion about, but by and large, the piece of legislation that is before us, I think is commendable, and it really does start to bring to the fore how we deal with this tension of preserving community heritage, dealing with ecological integrity and preserving that as well, along with still achieving economic development. Madam President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator.
Madam President, I beg that this session of the Chamber of the House of the Chamber be suspended until 3:45. 2:45. 2:45. I thought it was being overly generous. the substantive leader of the House would have my head. Thank you.
She would be entirely breaking her practice. So the question is that the Senate be now suspended until 2:45 this afternoon. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it. The Senate is now suspended until 2:45.